Buenos dias, good morning. My name is Dr. Luz Claudio. I'm a faculty member here at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. I personally want to apologize to all of you for this delay. I am honored to hold the space for you for this discussion, and I really welcome all of the comments and all of the learning that we will do together today in this morning. I have suggested to Ian and to all of us here, the panelists, that maybe would be a great idea and a great opportunity for us to put together opinion piece or a letter to an editor for a journal. So I will offer to humbly take the lead on that, but I really welcome all input to that draft as well. So I leave you to our distinguished panelists and welcome to Mount Sinai. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let me also begin by welcoming everyone to this panel session. My name is Brenda Morphia. I am the Oxfam International Head of the New York office, which is the UN office. Just briefly about our office, we are the representation office to the UN for Oxfam as a federation. We represent Oxfam in terms of policy analysis at the UN, but then much of our work has also been that of facilitating, ensuring that our work as Oxfam and that of our partners is directly inputting into the conversations around the UN. So thank you very much. I will be your moderator this morning. And just to set the stage, I would like to emphasize on the fact that this is a safe space. As Oxfam, we are very we take it very seriously that when we create dialogues such as this, everyone feels safe. All the opinions that will be expressed will be valid. We want to encourage everyone to express themselves without any fear. And then our spaces are also safe in terms of diversity. We welcome all opinions, and regardless of race, color, racial, sexual orientation, we want to make sure that this space articulates and provides as a space of safety. That said, welcome once again, everyone, to this very timely and extremely important session on loss and damage, grounding global policy in local experiences. Would like to discuss loss and damage, where we begin looking at what we have as policy, especially global policy, but also not forgetting the nature of policies that are coming through regional mechanisms, national mechanisms, as they're reflecting on local experience. Our guests today are very distinguished. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the honor and pleasure of having among our panelists Dr. Ian Fry, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights. We also have all the way from South Africa, our Oxfam South Africa, which is the only Oxfam affiliate on the African continent. Joining us today, Lebohang Ramafoko. She's the Executive Director of Oxfam. Welcome, Lebohang. We also have Adrian Martinez Blanco. Adrian is the Director of La Ruta de Clima. Adrian, wonderful meeting you in person. I think we communicated a lot. via email last year. So it's so good to meet you in person. Then we also have Isatis Sintron, Dr. Isatis Sintron, Climate Trace from Puerto Rico. Do we have? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yes. And then last but not the least, may I also welcome Amali Tawa, who's the founder and the executive director of Climate Refugees. We met last month during the UN General Assembly. So colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Excellency, loss and damage is front and center in this year's climate change policy debate. L&D is a conversation that we're encountering everywhere and in all spaces, yet many local communities remain unaware of these global level discussions, even as these discussions shape policy that is intended to support them in the face of climate impacts. La Ruta de Clima, together with Oxfam America, is working to bring together civil society organizations in Latin America and the United States to explore the shared experiences of frontline and marginalized communities who experience loss and damage. As part of building connections and solidarity among these communities, we hope this panel will help unpack the global dialogue on loss and damage, simplify the narrative, so to say, featuring the latest messages to global policymakers from the UN Special Rapporteur, who is present with us today, highlighting the lived experiences of loss and damage in Latin America, but as well as the US, among the communities here in the US, and explore key actions to shape the global response and ensure it responds to local priorities. Without much ado, I will welcome our panelists to give us some, to make a presentation and give us their thinking on this. I will allow all the speakers to take the floor for 10 minutes. Hopefully you can shorten it to 5 minutes. If not 5, then 7 minutes. So may I invite Dr. Fry, who have already introduced the UN Special Rapporteur, to take the first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to be here. So the issue of loss and damage is a very serious issue globally, and we have to think first about what are the impacts that climate change is having on people around the world. And there are estimates that 3.3 billion people are living in extreme vulnerability around the world. The International Federation of the Red Cross estimated that 97.6 million people were affected by climate change events in 2019. And there's a close sort of connection, intersection of a lot of issues associated with the impacts. And they relate to gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, indigenous identity, and disability. And all of those intersectional issues interplay with these impacts. In a report I gave to the UN General Assembly last year, I highlighted some of these issues. There were enormous floods in Madagascar and Mozambique. Pakistan last year suffered enormous floods. South Sudan went through a period of severe droughts, and then floods. And in the Central American region, Hurricane Iota and Eta is estimated to make 6.4 million people insecure from those impacts. And I recently visited Honduras and was able to witness firsthand the impacts that people had suffered as a consequence of those hurricanes. And if we think about the sort of losses in cost terms, the floods in Pakistan were estimated to cost $3.5 billion worth of damage. Recent hurricanes in Bangladesh around $2 billion. And there have been estimates that over the last 2 decades, the cost to countries as a consequence of climate change have been in the order of $525 billion worth of damage. Cyclone Amphan alone cost $15 billion to South Asian countries. And these are the issues. And there's a report which suggests that the United States, through its emissions, have caused $1.9 trillion worth of damage globally. So these are the issues around the sort of financial costs that are related to loss damage. But of course, there are a lot of non-economic losses as well. People lose their lives, they lose their culture, and to some their sovereignty as a consequence of climate change. So I visited Honduras just last month and was able to go to some remote communities. And the real tragedy there is people have suffered from a long drought, some have suffered from floods, sea level rise and storm surges. And all the communities I visited, people had left the country as a consequence of these climate change effects. So the country has been drained of its population, and people don't make that choice, as a free will issue. They have no choice. And this is the real tragedy around this. So to get to the sort of current negotiations on loss and damage, currently the Transitional Committee is meeting in Aswan in Egypt. This is a committee established to establish a loss and damage fund that was agreed at the last COP. From the reports I've received so far, it's not going so well. And in fact, the issue is around is who's going to manage the fund and where's the money going to come from? I remember attending a workshop in 2014 in Nandi, Fiji, where the US representative said there is no place for loss and damage in the Paris Agreement. So this was in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. And since then, they have been playing this game of basically stalling and interrupting the negotiations. The person who said that statement in Nandi is now on the Transitional Committee and playing the same game. So they're trying to push off the loss and damage fund to the World Bank. And we know that there are serious issues with the World Bank managing a fund. They have a conflict of interest because they still fund fossil fuel projects. They're very inaccessible for communities to get funding. So there are real issues around that. So the arrangements around the loss and damage fund are not very well. And this is particularly the US playing a disruption game in this process, and that's very disappointing. There have been some interesting ideas of where the money should come from. In my report to General Assembly last year, I said, we have to think outside the box. We're talking about orders of magnitude much far greater than what can be delivered, in public finance. And so there's, discussions around drawdowns from the IMF, talking about taxes on fossil fuels. The fossil fuel company Saudi Aramco made $121 billion last year. So do we think they should be putting some money into, for the costs of the damage they're causing? So these are some of the sort of issues around the funding arrangements and trying to think outside the box. And I think Joseph Stiglitz said just last week around this IMF drawdowns. But there are a lot of interesting ideas out there, and hopefully we can find a forum where the US doesn't play this blocking game, so that we can have a serious debate around where's the money going to come from. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. And may I also recognize our online participants? I see that we have quite a number of people who have joined this meeting. Thank you very much, Doc. I'm not going to attempt to summarize your very succinct presentation to us, where you've highlighted for us the amount of consequence that we're experiencing, climate impact in different parts of the world, where you've actually visited and witnessed some of the impact. You've also highlighted for us the development, which is in a way welcome, the putting in place the loss and damage fund, the mechanism itself, but also reminded us of some of the challenges that we are experiencing in terms of the fund being operationalized. Thank you very much. We have also taken note of the role that certain member states are playing therein, including the US. May I, at this juncture, invite our next panelist, Ms. Lebohang Ramafoko, the Executive Director of Oxfam South Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me and allowing me to come and speak at this very important meeting. And I greet my fellow panelists as well. According to the International Fund for Agricultural Development, at least 70% of the very poor live in rural areas, most of them depending partly or sometimes completely on agriculture for their livelihoods. It is estimated that 500 million smallholder farms in the developing world are supporting almost 2 billion people. And in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, these small farms produce about 80% of the food that is being consumed. With the result of COVID, the crisis around hunger and around food insecurity has been exacerbated, and climate change will further deepen it. In South Africa, the food security of rural households is inextricably linked to the sustainability of the country's agriculture industry, which supplies not only food, but income and employment to more than 70% of the population. Smallholder farmers are particularly vulnerable to climate change due to their reliance on rain-fed agriculture, insufficient access to land, high poverty and poor education levels, limited access to extension training, adaptation training, and lack of financial support to adopt to adaptive measures. While climate change adaptation has proven to be an effective strategy to manage climate change threats, smallholder farmers face several challenges when deciding whether to adapt. Several factors that affect them include inadequate credit access, inadequate education and training, lack of crop insurance, and infrequent extension visits. We recognize the progressive decision taken after over 30 years in the struggle for loss and damage finances, particularly as a result of rich countries blocking, and a loss and damage funding mechanism was agreed to be established. However, much of a win this fund truly is for climate change, for climate justice, will depend on two things. One, it is how it is designed to reach climate vulnerable communities. And secondly, whether it is adequately funded with new and additional finance. And with just what my previous speaker has said, I think both of them are very questionable and, might I say, at risk. This year is critical, particularly for how the fund is designed to reach climate vulnerable communities. We will not get a second chance to set up this fund, and it is much more difficult to influence a fund once it is already set up, as is seen with the Green Climate Fund. And so our consolidated push at Oxfam is to be vocal on achieving a fund that is grounded in justice and serves affected people first and foremost. This is a rare opportunity to set up a fund that truly tries to shift power away from donor-led structures and towards local actors and marginalized communities. We are going to COP28, and at COP28, we need to see the structure of the fund agreed in the form of a governing instrument, and the structure needs to enable affected countries and communities in achieving climate resilient development, with a window specifically focusing on communities having direct access to the fund. The fund needs to be inclusive, representative, deliver grant-based finance, comprehensive, and central to the system of addressing loss and damage. There are two key issues that we as Oxfam, particularly Oxfam South Africa, wish to reiterate to ensure the establishment of a viable and transformational mechanism for the betterment of millions of populations impacted by the irreversible consequences of climate change. Firstly, the Loss and Damage Fund must enable local leadership in responding to climate-fueled events and support gender transformative action. We do recognize that men and women are not affected similar to climate change. Women, even in countries like South Africa, who are left in rural areas, who are tending to children, who are tending to these small-scale farmers, are often left out when these decisions are made. And rather than just making a fund that is gender blind, we need to pay attention to make a fund that understands that part of its mechanism is to address gender inequality. It is essential to transition from existing top-down strategies to a fresh paradigm where local stakeholders are empowered with increased authority and resources to fortify their resilience against climate change. We have an example where, as Oxfam South Africa, we worked in Morodova and worked with communities to design infrastructure projects such as the construction of high elevated roads, 3 bridges, and a system to improve drainage capacity from floods and rehabilitation of mangroves. This project was gender sensitive. It employed 4,700 people, 60% of them being women. So we do have examples of how this can be done. Furthermore, local organizations and affected communities must have representative in the operation of the fund. The fund should have a simplified and accessible application process and should support local actors in the early stages of response and should be disaggregated by gender to understand the extent of vulnerability to define tailored solutions. The outcome of COP28 should be an agreement on the governing instrument, which must clearly outline governance and the structure of the fund. That is, a governing instrument should be agreed that sits under the UNFCCC as an operating entity of the financial mechanism to the convention. It should comprehensively address loss and damage and deliver grant-based financing that is adequate and predictable, be central to the system of addressing loss and damage, and is open to all developing countries. In addition, for our fight against climate change impacts to succeed, it requires a strong leadership, collaboration, and investment. We recognize the heads of states in the developing world in partnership with international organizations, but we also urge them to create an enabling policy environment that incentivizes sufficient investments, that promotes social inclusion in decision-making and supports research and development. Lastly, as Oxfam, we are committed to facilitate learning on various emerging issues through thought leadership platforms. Our work is driven by the need to build a constituency for pro-poor centered laws and policies integral to developing climate and just energy transition. The global community thus plays a pivotal role to has a pivotal role to play in ensuring that marginalized frontline communities' voices are represented in developing community resilience building initiatives that are anchored by a climate justice approach at local, national, and regional levels to meet our mitigation and adaptation targets. And nobody must be left behind, particularly women and children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lebo. I think Lebo has just concluded the meeting. She has brought the local experience and voice into the room very strongly, reminded us of the need to ensure that as we advocate for the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, we need to ensure that it is localized. It's not only localized, but also it has to reflect the gender vulnerabilities. Thank you, Lebo, for also sharing some of the work that Oxfam South Africa has been doing in various communities locally, mitigating climate change. In the interest of time, I will now call upon our next speaker, Adrian Martinez Blanco, the Executive Director of La Ruta de Clima. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, all of you, for being here. It's always very hard to take time to speak and join together to try to push through issues that sometimes seems too abstract, but at the end do impact the lives of many people, of millions of people around the world. Also thank our friends in Oxfam and all the different partners that have joined, Mount Sinai for letting us have this space, Amali, Mr. Ian, and all of the others, Climate Trace Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican Alliance, and many others that have been pushing and will continue to push this issue together. And as Mr. Ian said, this is a 30-year-old problem that we are facing. For 30 years old, 3 decades, the US and the European Union and many developed countries have been avoiding responsibility. And we have managed, and I think we said civil society has been a key part of it, to bring responsibility knocking on their doors, finally. There is the ICJ opinion, there is the Inter-American Court, so human rights courts are right there. And right now, we're also trying to create a systemic response to address loss and damage through justice. That is the Loss and Damage Fund. But it can go wrong. It can go very, very wrong. But we have to ensure that it does not. How can it go wrong? Well, people, when they receive funding, are at the most vulnerable moment in their lives. And this is a lesson that I learned thanks to the struggle of our Puerto Rican friends. When they received aid from Maria, they were at the weakest, most desperate moment. And that led to the monetization of suffering and climate impacts through privatization, land grabbing, gentrification, and just racism and violence. A bad loss and damage fund can monetize the suffering of millions and open access to markets and weak states. So when I see the World Bank trying to take charge of the loss and damage fund, I see the monetization of suffering from an institution that has a very dark history in my region, Latin America. In Latin America, there is a lot of debt, even though there is a lot of GDP in some countries. That means the money comes in and goes out to the global north with all the resources. There is extreme poverty and also extreme vulnerability to climate impacts. So it has a very specific need of accessing an open access to loss and damage fund. And this is not something that we want as a donation. And we see a conflict of interest when we see the big historical emitters trying to take charge and define how the mechanisms that will provide reparations and responsibility to the damage, that transboundary environmental harm that they have profited and are responsible of enacting, because climate change is the result of economic policies of people. Where I was yesterday in Washington, D.C., the home of Paragraph 51, that which does not enable us to talk about liability and compensation within the UNFCCC despite international law, despite of human rights law. And one of the lessons that I learned in Puerto Rico, and it is funny because people always confuse Puerto Rico with Costa Rica, and sadly, there's many reasons for that that are not just because they have beautiful beaches and nice people, but because we have been also struggling against privatization, colonization, and gentrification from the US. And the lessons that I learned is that very quickly what we are slowly burning and suffering and defending can be speed up through a very big climate impact in extreme weather event. So in response of how should we shape the loss and damage fund that I learned from Puerto Ricans is that support has to be decentralized. So when I have the transitional committee not talking to communities, not visiting the ground, not speaking especially with indigenous people, not addressing the leaders that are women on communities, for example, in Puerto Rico or in elsewhere in Central America, when they're left behind to deal with an ecosystem that is failing and they have to sustain the life of children and people with disabilities or the elderly, when you do not address their perspective of what should be done, then you're not doing your job and you're setting the stage for discrimination and failure. And the decentralization of access of resources is one of the things that Puerto Ricans mentioned, because that's what they did experience. By centralizing everything on governments that are unable to provide the resources, you negate the access to the needed resources to save lives. Then there has to be continued preparedness of all communities to address loss and damage, and all governments and institutions. There has to be a definition of what is a public essential service that cannot be based on money and capital. It has to be on human rights. And that is something I doubt that World Bank would understand. And then another key issue is the leadership of women. It is women that are left behind in the Americas, holding the agriculture, holding the production, finding water for people, and taking care of everyone. And it was also in Puerto Rico when I visited. And I keep mentioning Puerto Rico because as a Central American, I realize that there are US citizens and Latin Americans. They might not want to be US citizens, but they are somehow. And if that's all they get, what can I get then? If the US and the climate envoy says they want to put no money on reparations or loss and damage, and they're US citizens. So that's something to think when we give them the space to define how our path to justice. We require equity. We require historical, common, but differentiated responsibilities in the fund. And we, of course, require a human rights approach. So I want to thank you all for coming here, all your comments and support. And I think this is the moment to either have a loss and damage fund that increases our access to justice or that monetizes suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. In addition to educating us on the difference between Puerto Rico and Costa Rica, you have taken the conversations into us looking at the nuances, when we talk about localization, that our sister here stressed on. What does that mean? You remind us on the need for us to ensure that the support has to be centralized. You bring in strongly the need for preparedness of communities, nations. you remind us of the need for us to define the response and emphasize on it not necessarily being centered on money, but meaningfully on human rights. You bring us back again to the aspect of gender, women, the essence, equity, and most importantly and overall, the need for us to have a human rights approach. So thank you very much. I will now call upon our next speaker who is joining us online. Amelie Tower.
It's online.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Is Isati Citron, who is the Dr. Isati Citron, who is from Climate Trace, Puerto Rico. Welcome. I hope you can hear us. Please say something. Oh, okay. Thank you.
I can hear
Over to
you.
you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, La Ruta, for organizing this space, and Oxfam and Mount Sinai as well. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very sad that I cannot be in person. Currently, I am in Egypt at the TC Transitional Committee meetings on loss and damage. So this topic is at the heart of my days this week. And I wanna, I guess, like to go a little bit more into the Puerto Rican case, right? Because I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I have been kind of raising the flag inside of the UNFCCC process about loss and damage and what that would mean for my people. There are, as Adrian said, there are some nuances. I would say that those nuances are not necessarily because of loss and damage, but about what, like a legacy of colonialism makes in a country, and then how that is enabled, or, like the disaster of the disaster capitalism, like how vulnerable conditions further vulnerabilize and make, provide an entrance to private and not the best interest in the people. One of the most recent cases, right, it's Hurricane Maria, and we have a population in Puerto Rico that is 62.2% are in the coastal municipalities. And Maria left us with, like 100,000 millions in losses, and a death toll of 4,695 people. And I think that's very important when we talk about, because one of the places that is more vulnerable in terms of the risk and the losses in the prison years are not taken into consideration in these conversations, right? As Puerto Rico being a territory of the United States, we are invisible in this process because we are not being taken into consideration at any place inside of the fund. Because as a U.S. territory, we should be good, right? So we know for sure that that is not the case, and we need to understand the limitations of the fund and the process so that we can push for, an advanced process. It's so dreaded, and it's so limited, the process that is here, that even when we're talking about, some of the 3 key things to make this process or loss and damage more available to communities, that is, direct access, where is the fund located, right? In terms of located, like what is the host entity? Is that World Bank? And then the governance, right? Like we need to have representation of vulnerable and frontline communities. We need that the access goes directly to communities. But then even talking that, like we're starting so far behind in the current processes of climate finance that even proposing that doesn't get to, a colony like Puerto Rico, because when we're talking about direct access, there's so many people that have been left out of the process that talking about this seems so far like removed from the realities, but yet in the ground, what we are leaving is like a trail of unsupported and people that basically, like the international community, are giving them their backs to, like very vulnerable places. So I think that something very important in this is recognizing that loss and damage is not charity, and that we need to make sure that justice is centered in when we are designing modalities and when we are deciding what that can be, and then taking into consideration what are the national approaches. Like, for example, what will the U.S. responsibility, liability, and response should be to not only Puerto Rico, but other territories and disadvantaged communities within its borders. So how can we, when we're localizing that fund, it's not only what the international community is doing, but also how do we make sure that developed countries are taking responsibility and acting within their borders to ensure that we have, well, they don't want liability, but ensure that they have a response that is responsible, like that they have responsibility by the legacy that they have created. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I hope you're enjoying beautiful Egypt. And again, I think the conversation has continued into going deeper into the nuances. She brings in the legacy of colonization, issues and questions, and the need for us to look around that and take the trace some of the root causes and where it's coming from. She also speaks to the disaster of capitalism and how, as we discuss loss and damage, it's essentially another mechanism that speaks very strongly to how our economies are established, but also some of the things that we have to look out to ensure that meaningfully the fund, if established and operationalized, does save the communities that are impacted. So thank you very much. Isatis, thank you if you're still with us. Hopefully you can stay with us until the end so that we allow for an engagement. May I, at this point in time, invite our last panelist, Amali Tower, who is the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. Over to you, Amali.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, La Ruta, Oxfam, and all the partners that put this together to Mount Sinai. It's really lovely to be here with you all, with people I consider heroes in this work. And okay, so I'm going last. So let me be very intentional about adding things to the conversation of the incredible things that have already been said, all of which I wholeheartedly agree with. So obviously, being the founder of an organization named Climate Refugees, I'm very focused on displacement, right? And I see colleagues here in the audience that I've worked with in the refugee context that's informed from our existing framework, the 1951 Refugee Convention. And, working in this context, it's very, what shall I say, common understanding for us that displacement doesn't work in a vacuum. It's not like a conflict comes around, You're attacked by an armed actor and you flee. It's usually how does that conflict work with existing vulnerabilities, with the lack of social protections, with underdevelopment, with weak governments, with historic legacies of colonialism, with being a marginalized or indigenous person, um, and being in an underdeveloped region of your country even, which might make you even more disproportionately vulnerable to the conflict. And you might flee to another country and seek protection under the convention, but hasn't all the other things I said about drivers and how conflict might intersect with other things, isn't that kind of like starting to ring a little bit familiar to you about how the climate context might work and how those same exact populations might exist in situations that are not of their own doing, that are not of their creating, and worse yet, they have absolutely no power to stop it, nor to determine what the means of redress and justice are? I mean, this is fundamentally a massive issue of injustice, right? Climate injustice. And we don't have frameworks to protect people who might have to move, who are forced to move, who are at the mercy of increasing and unwitting disasters that they've had no, role in creating. And then worse yet, they're also not even, as Ian was saying, right? They're not even being consulted at the TC that Isatis is at right now, right? And how exactly should this fund work? What should it look like? Whom should it serve? So, having said that, I think we all know that, what we do know about our climate disasters, what we call sudden onset disasters that are displacing about 23 million people a year internally within their countries. Do we know what that looks like across borders? Not really, because we don't actually have any frameworks or, political will even to really know how are people moving across borders. And, Dr. Fry's amazing, first report last year will spell that out. And it was so validating to see that, right? Because it's what we know, it's what communities tell us, but we need to say that out loud in these frameworks. Worse yet, we don't know much at all about how our slow onset climate effects impacting human beings, their human rights, their right to migrate, their right to stay. Are they being displaced? What does that look like? How is it intersecting with those other existing vulnerabilities I mentioned? So that said, 110 million people are forcibly displaced in the world today. Those aren't all just refugees, right? It's about 33 million people who might have the legal status of refugee. The rest are then what? Internally displaced within their own homes, or asylum seekers, are probably in this like unknown nebulous of how does this all intersect with climate? So we need to know more about who these people are, because my goodness, isn't that like the mere modicum of how we can ensure dignity to be seen that this is what you're going through and this is how climate is eroding your rights? All that said, from a global context, let me turn to some work we did in Kenya last year, a country I've lived in, and I was still stunned to return to see how climate change is eroding basic human rights and dignities for people. Kenya is going through concurrently floods and a drought at the same time. People who are being displaced by the Rift Valley lakes that have actually, swollen so much that it has actually broken its banks and displaced communities are also simultaneously now going through a drought. So imagine being somebody whose home is underwater and who is equally going through a drought and is saying, if it wasn't for this disastrous drought, and let me tell you how that's impacted my life, we would continue to be dealing with this excessive rainfall. And by the way, both the drought and the floods, climate scientists have come to realize are very much the impacts of climate change. So visiting 10 distinct locations throughout Kenya is a country that's also hosting, Andrew would know better than I, well over 500,000 refugees. Yeah, both in Kakuma and Dadaab refugee camps. The refugees that are coming into those camps are increasingly climate displaced communities from South Sudan and from Somalia and from Ethiopia. UNHCR will tell you about 200,000 people have crossed over into Kenya from the current Horn of Africa drought. So to say nothing of what we know in terms of refugee flows, Kenya itself is also dealing with, and surprise, surprise, we don't even know the full number. The flood displacement is about 300,000 to maybe 400,000. During Africa Climate Week, President Ruta mentioned 2.3 million. I've seen other numbers, IFRC 1.4. Like, who knows? And it again speaks to what I'm saying, like people aren't numbers, but at the same time, we don't even know how many people actually need loss and damage redress, right? Of these local communities that we met with that are sustaining what I can only describe as development setbacks, put another way, loss and damage, right? So all the sustainable development goals that we've even set out to try and achieve, not only have any gains been eroded, but now we really should be looking at those through the lens of loss and damage, and we need to be documenting it as such so that we can, at the TC and at COP28, actually call for solutions that are grounded in that type of justice. Just to tell you really, a few things. In this report, we broke down the losses through a human rights framework. So how is climate change eroding the right to education? Well, if you're a flood displaced community, the one school that you did have that multiple islands came to on one island called Kokwa, taking a boat, now can't access that school. Why? Because the floods are the waters are so high that they lack the boats because of their endemic poverty to even cross the lake to get to the school. If you did manage to get to the island, guess what? The school is submerged. So people haven't gone to school for 4 years. It took the Kenyan government, a low to middle income country, like I said, over 5 years to even rebuild the one school. And this is to say, this is in a region where schools are in short supply. The drought, if you go to the Turkana region, women and girls, any rights that we have gained for increasing the empowerment of women and girls' education are being eroded. Why? Because they now have to forego school in order to dig more and deeper water holes in search of water. So the right to water is also being eroded, right? And then guess what? Because those water holes are so deep, they're actually capsizing on human beings. And there have been people who have been reported as dying within these water holes. It's been reported to the Kenyan government and not much has come out of it. These are exactly the types of examples of loss and damage that I think we need to see it as, right? And then let's not also forget that people are, like I said, left behind. They're displaced. Some are in recognized IDP camps, where after the camp was set up, no other humanitarian presence was seen. So even in their displacement camps, they're left to fend for themselves. Some are completely trapped. And their testimonies were, if somebody could help us actually build a home on higher ground on this island, because why? Guess what? Just like everybody else, they don't want to be forced to leave their homes. Some, like in the Turkana region, where you have agropastoralists and pastoralists, and that's what all of these communities are, have an indigenous history, millennia of circular migration, because they're semi-nomadic. They're telling me that cultural right is being eroded because we really can't come back. There's nothing to come back to. And if I want to send the youngest member of my family across the border into Uganda, into its highlands, where there is water, where there are grazing lands for our goats, we're then telling them don't come back because the rains still haven't come. It's the 6th failed rainy season. So we can see that in terms of obvious displacement migration. But also, what about the cultural rights? What about the oral histories that aren't passed on in these communities? To say nothing of all the underdevelopment that I mentioned is going on in their own communities. The transitional committee that's meeting in Aswan now, I would say, has a historic opportunity to include refugees and displaced people, for whom, honestly, the loss and damage fund is life-saving. You know, just this quick snapshot I've given you of Kenya, if this isn't a declared humanitarian crisis, or it's not a well-known climate disaster like the hurricanes here in the US, Maria, Puerto Rico, that Isatis mentioned, Cyclone Amphan, for example, right? The things that have elevated into like mainstream media, short of that, where do you go? Is the humanitarian system triggered? It is not. You're a low to middle income country where development is kind of sustained within the SDGs. That's not happening. So these are people completely getting left behind. And thank you. And the only thing I can say as far as like a solution goes is what the IGAD countries are doing, 8 East African countries who have free movement protocols across their borders for these communities, for pastoralist communities. And now they've gone so far as to actually develop another addendum, if you will. It's not really what it is, but another sort of like free movement protocol to say people need to be protected to be able to move across borders, and we need to foster that because of the context of climate change. So isn't it crazy that the very countries who have contributed nothing to this, who are being sidelined in the creation of solutions within the UNFCCC, are the very ones cooperating? Why? Because to be on the front lines of this crisis is to recognize that without global cooperation, there can be no solutions for anybody. So I think there's a lot to learn from developing countries. And lastly, I'll just say, because COP is happening next month, let's not forget that the very migrants that are building the COP28 facility come from the front lines of climate change crises countries. I'm talking about migrants from Southeast Asia, from countries like my own, Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Pakistan floods, the cyclones in the Philippines. And what's happening? They're building facilities in the extreme heat in the Gulf countries, and they're dying. And we already know this from Qatar and the World Cup of people who died. And the same thing is happening now in the UAE. So we can look at the injustice of this from multiple angles. And I think all of that needs to be part of it. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really grateful to have had the time with you all. Thank you.
A conversation like this requires us to be in this room for the entire day. But unfortunately, we don't have that time. Amelia, we have less than 30 minutes for us to engage in a conversation. So let me just say, with everything that you reminded us of, I picked one very key point. You said we need to know more. We need to know more. That said, do we have any questions? I will take a round of questions. Ashley, I'm not sure how we're intending to engage our online participants. Is there room for that?
Are we using this microphone or? Oh, the online will do later, right? Yeah.
So we will be able to receive the questions in the chat box. And we can certainly monitor them if they come up. Then we have a question. We do have a question in person.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you very much for asking said question. And please feel free to just.
Do you need me to get the mic?
Yeah. So perhaps let's take more hands. Anyone? Okay, please
Sure.
come.
If you could just use the microphone as you have your questions for our translators, for the folks online. That would be very appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Edil Sepulveda. I'm an earth climate scientist in a federal government agency, and I'm also the founder of a Puerto Rican organization that is called the Puerto Rican Alliance. So thank you again to Oxfam, who is organizing this, to La Ruta del Clima, Adrian, that I had the pleasure to meet you, Isatis, that I want to work with you, so maybe we can follow up. And also thank you, because I was very happy to hear, I think it was from Lebogan, that you talk a lot about empowering local stakeholders. Some of the topics that I didn't expect to hear in loss and damages. So thank you for that. So I have a question specifically for Ian, but anyone else can jump in to answer. Our work in our organization is focused in decolonization specifically, and Isat is talk here that obviously in Puerto Rico we have a problem with colonialism. We have been a colony of the U.S. for 125 years. So our work has been focused. I am based in Washington, D.C. Our work has been focused in the U.S. Congress instead of like the United Nations. We have been pushing for, especially after Hurricane Maria, a just recovery, climate resilience, climate justice, clean energy transition, but also democratic rights and self-determination and decolonization. And because Puerto Rico is under the territorial clause of the United States Constitution, obviously the U.S. has jurisdiction over all of the affairs of Puerto Rico, and it's specifically a committee in the U.S. Congress that is the Committee on Natural Resources that has the jurisdiction over Puerto Rico. So the territories of the U.S., they fall under the Committee on Natural Resources. They see the territories and the land as natural resources. So we push with other organizations in Puerto Rico, and it was approved last year, $1 billion for solar rooftop and storage for vulnerable households. That money right now, there are conversations with stakeholders in Puerto Rico on how it's going to be utilized and give to communities. We're pushing so it can go directly to the NGOs. Oh, yes. So sorry for that. I just wanted to give some context. We have been pushing for these topics in the U.S. Congress, and I think that we have achieved a couple of things because we have had some projects that have been presented. At the same time, we have come to the United Nations to talk about Puerto Rico in the UN Decolonization Committee and ask them if they can include Puerto Rico in the list of self-governed territories and present the issue of Puerto Rico in the UN General Assembly. The question is specifically, you talk about the U.S. doing a blocking game in the topics of loss and damages, but also in topics like this, like decolonization. So the specific question will be, where do we focus our efforts? Both, we're talking here locally about Puerto Rico, but when we talk about climate justice, loss and damages, do we focus in the U.S. Congress, in the U.S. government that has so much power to block, or do we focus our efforts in the UN and in the international community, and how can we be effective doing that when we have the U.S. government blocking, those efforts? So sorry for taking so long.
May I just remind, for us to make this meaningfully interactive, can we please, when called upon, ask your question? So, I think let's take a round and then we will, yeah. I hope Dr. Fry took that question down.
Thanks. Andrew Fuse, work with Church World Service, CWS, a global humanitarian organization. We had a chance to document experiences within our partner communities of loss and damage. And my question is, I think a good follow-up, how can we make that available to decision makers, especially in Washington? Who needs to get that information? And especially here, the demand for local access and the idea that this is to complement resources that people are already bringing to respond to loss and damage in places where they are. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take one last question. Do we have anything from online? Yes.
This is coming from an anonymous person, which is fine. I'll ask the question. It's quite good. My name's Ashley. I'm from Oxfam America. And thank you all for being here today. The TC hasn't consulted with Indigenous peoples and local communities as part of their work. What do you suggest parties do at COP28 to ensure that their views are incorporated into negotiations on the loss and damage mechanism? Thank you.
Thank you. So considering there was a specific question addressed to one of the panelists, I'll invite Dr. Ian to respond to that question. But then for the other two questions, I think I'll also just invite the panelists to take that up in case you are able to take.
Well, so thank you very much for the question. It's a difficult one to answer because I'm not familiar with the decolonization initiatives of Puerto Rico in the UN. But clearly, there are a number of countries who are pursuing that. And the question is, do you pursue that more, or do you pursue, initiatives through the Congress or the UN? I suspect Congress is a bit of a challenge at the moment, and probably not the best avenue to pursue these sorts of issues. And trying to get support from other countries that are trying to decolonize would be helpful. To form a group of countries who are initiating that, and there are certainly UN committees looking at that. Inherent within that question is a country that's a colony of a developed country eligible for funding for the Loss and Damage Fund? And that's the challenge, I think. And I suspect your best avenue is through litigation. To actually, because you're citizens of the US, you can, seek reparations through the courts. And I would encourage you to explore that. I think you'd have a better chance of getting funding that way than would through a sort of back to a UN process. Maybe I can ask these issues about certainly getting local access, decisions. I mean, this is the challenge within the Loss and Damage Fund. And I have a strong sense of deja vu with this because I was involved for many years as a negotiator for Tuvalu, small Pacific Island country. And we went through the same debates with the Green Climate Fund. And of course, the donors want to have control. And that's the challenge. How do you, de-donorize these funds? And that's, that's just an ongoing challenge. And the critical thing is we should be sourcing money from outside just simple donations from countries so that we do have more autonomy. And finally, with the question about Indigenous peoples, and this is a critical issue, and I brought this up in my reports to the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly, and I was supposed to be attending a meeting of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, which is a sort of formal body established under the Climate Convention to give a voice for Indigenous peoples. The problem with that platform is that it doesn't have a formal agenda item in the COP. And therefore, Indigenous peoples can have a 30-minute statement at the beginning of the COP and a 30-second statement at the end. And there's no formal process for allowing Indigenous peoples' concerns to be brought into the COP and brought in specifically into loss and damage discussions. And that's, a change has to be made. And this, I was suggesting that a country needs to request an agenda item under the COP to allow the local communities, Indigenous peoples platform to report on their deliberations and have a say in the consultations. That requires a sympathetic country to do that. So hopefully we can find a country who is willing to request that agenda item. Thank you.
I was going to call Adrian to also contribute to that question.
Could I answer? Because I need to leave by 6:30.
Yes.
Yes. So I wanted to answer like some of the points, some in all of the questions, but I will start by Puerto Rico. I think that it's not a matter of either or. I think it's a matter of both. I would say that in the international sphere, we had, it was not last year, but the COP before, we had 15 delegates, all from civil society, but those that know Puerto Rico, it's, like civil society is plagued by autogestión, which don't know the I don't know the translation. So anyway, I think that we had bigger delegations than some of the countries as civil society. That doesn't mean that we have a say in the process, but there is a presence on these issues. On the topic of like where to focus, right? I think that at the national level, like at the both at the Puerto Rican level and then at the connection with US, I think there needs to be more engagement between Puerto Ricans in the island and then the diaspora, and how the diaspora can support the calls that are coming from Puerto Rico. We have had issues in the past with some diaspora supporting things like Promesa, right? So I think that it's a matter of like making sure that there is alignment and connection, and you know, like how can we make that available, you know, in terms of funds. I think that in the US there was this question today in how to engage more with the with Congress. And there was a question, like, what if we have a bad fund coming out of this process? What is our call for the US government? Are we going to ask, you know, like push very strongly for strong support? Like what is our ask? But definitely, you know, like we need to not only operationalize but also fund the fund, and having like an optimistical view, say that we have a good fund, or like we won't have a good fund, we will have maybe an okay fund. So I think that we need to focus in how do we make sure that we engage those that are in power, if we have a fund that we can live with, to really support it so that we have it actually impacting communities.
Thank you very much. We are really running out of time, so I'd like to invite Adrian to respond in 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Sure. I think there's two things: participation and access. So when you see participation and you see, for example, indigenous peoples, the fact that they have not included or replicated or copy pasted things that are already existing in the adaptation fund, in the green climate fund, and the global environmental facility about focal points or advisory committees of indigenous people, it is just on purpose, because they could just copy paste what it's already in financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC. So it is willingly excluding them from there. Then, in terms of participation, both the UNFCCC Secretariat in the whole process of the UNFCCC of the TC does not acknowledge it as a right. They had not opened. They had the climate weeks. They could have done consultations. There is Zoom, but they have not. So this is a basic thing that we also have seen in the conferences of not respecting the right for effective participation as a human right. That is why there was not a civics place in COP27. So it is a systemic, and it is part of the UNFCCC's disassociation from international and human rights law. So it is the Secretariat and the host country existing and executing their processes on their own without the law. And that's the issue of access. And this is very important in terms of this fund. As Amali mentioned, Kenya, middle income country, just like mine, does it deserve access to the fund? Or Puerto Rico, a colony from a developed country, does it deserve access to the fund? My country has 70% debt. All the GDP that we generate goes out because it's all for extractivism and tourism. And then we have extreme inequality in wage gaps between communities, and those are profiting from our country. So those communities that are living in 37 degrees, subjected to flooding, picking up pineapples so Europeans can eat fruit, do they deserve funding? I think they do. So when we say access should be open to all, it should be open to all, because we should be having a fund focused on communities and their needs and their human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And you have just highlighted one issue that Oxfam is currently preoccupied with, the aspect of inequality. I haven't heard much about inequality in this room, but I'm happy that you brought that out. In several meetings and conversations around the UN, whenever a question is posed on the most pressing challenges of our time, for people to identify the most pressing challenges of our time, inequality and climate change pops up almost immediately. However, and this is my personal observation, I see a lot of times that the only time when we see meaningful action and conversations around climate change is when COP is about to happen. Safe to say, there's been a number of initiatives and efforts in reminding everyone that climate change is not just a COP issue. Initiatives such as the SDG, synergizing SDG and COP synergizing meetings, and several other dotted conversations always remind us of the essence for us to meaningfully and continuously be engaging on climate change. But unfortunately, that is not happening. In between COP, you rarely see actions. One of the objectives of this meeting was to explore key actions and collaborations to advance loss and damage agenda at global, national, and local levels. I'd like to invite Dr. Fry to comment on how we can ensure that climate change, loss and damage becomes a continuous conversation and a reminder of policy makers throughout the year. And it doesn't wait for the anger sessions to see you come back to New York, or for COP to be almost happening and then people start talking about this. Next year, we are very fortunate that one of the SDGs under review is GO13. I think that is an opportunity for all of us. Speaking for the Oxfam International Office to the UN, we have been engaging in the high-level political forum. We are seeing this as an opportunity, not just for July, but beginning to meaningfully bring all these experiences that we're talking about, all the solutions that we're talking about right from the start of the year when we start talking about that particular agenda. So I know I'm probably exploiting you, but it's not every day. It's not every day that we get a UN special rapporteur to join us, considering that this is a very busy period. It's anger committee sessions. The fact that you've come to us, it means that there is real commitment there. So please comment. Let us know how we can take this forward and what actions perhaps we should be exploring as a collective. Thank you.
Tell us.
Thank you for that question. Look, I don't think the discussions on loss and damage are going to end at this COP. I'm not sure we'll even get a conclusion on a loss and damage fund, but the whole issue of loss and damage should infiltrate all the discussions that are going on at the international level. So the CEDAW committees, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women have annual meetings. There are meetings of the Human Rights Council that are present. There's just the Committee on the Rights of the Child that just produced a general comment about connections between children and climate change, and so there'll be follow-up to that. So there are a number of international fora from the human rights perspective, and for the Futures Summit that the Secretary General is going to have next year. these are all entry points where we need to bring forward loss and damage. We have to elevate this issue throughout a whole lot of other fora, so that the communities do have an input. And this is the Committee on Indigenous Peoples that meet regularly. There are all sorts of entry points that we can bring this forward. Thank you.
It's 11:30. I will invite all the panelists to a minute's closing remarks. Lebo, can we start with you? If you could all kindly just come here so that we make this quick. Amelie and Adrian.
Just line up.
Line up, okay.
It's never lost to me that one gets an opportunity to find who your collaborators are when you are outside of your country. And you hear about Kenya, and you hear about Puerto Rico, and you hear about how so many of us in our little corners are doing similar work. And I think for me, in conclusion, it is how do we work together and build solidarity, because we are really complementing each other. So while one supports and really endorses what different countries are doing from their vantage point, and we want that supported, I do think that, and I know that our Oxfam office here in New York is very good at that, is how do we have these sessions for the whole day? And I will agree with Brenda to make sure that we collaborate, because I think it is when we stand together in solidarity at platforms, whether it's CEDAW, CSW, UNGA, HOP, if we come together in one voice and shift the narrative around, the global south or the global majority and what impacts us, that is the way in which we are going to win. So solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. Thank you.
There's so much we can say, but I think I like to think about what are the barriers to solutions. And it seems to me, especially as somebody who has grown up in both the global north and the global south, how do we equate the playing field? And I don't just mean the institutions, the regional, the frameworks that exist, which are flawed as they are, but how do we equate that humanity? How do we equate without addressing the fact that let's just face it, decision makers, global north actors tend to view certain lives as less than, and that is pervasive throughout our world and our societies and our structures, our laws, our institutions. And we don't have to only talk about that in the context of climate change. That is the playing field. So how do we have that conversation so that we don't have to wait for global north actors to feel the enormity of loss and damage the way current communities in global south are, before we have actual solutions rooted in justice?
So first out, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you all the collaboration from all our partners. And I guess just to close, as a Central American, for me, speaking here is always about dignity. And it's always about not asking for a right, but exercising my right for justice. And there is justice in demanding reparations. And I think to build justice is why also we came to the US, because there is a big obstacle, and it's a political obstacle that is in DC. And we want to build power from Latin America with the US civil society to change that, as we also want to work with other partners around the world. But I think beyond what is feasible and what we can get, we should always strive to human dignity and our rights. Thank you.
She said she was leaving. So thank you once again to our virtual panel participants. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. And Thank you also to our panelist who was able to join us virtually. Thank you to colleagues that made this meeting. Thank you to our dear panelists for sharing your insights. I'm not going to add anything, but perhaps just welcome everyone to a cup of coffee and some donuts as we continue engaging. Thank you once again. Where I come from Zambia. We say twatotela sana.
Yes, thank you. So glad to have you. Well, thank you. This was very, very rich.